Well, congratulations. You've made it to the final video. This is Unit 7 of the Africa Mission Healthcare Train the Trainer video, intended to help train people who will go on to train other people on program and project management. So we're going to wrap up by talking a bit about project organization and a bit about other topics that are relevant when we think about why projects succeed and why projects fail. And let's just start talking a bit about team structure. Um, Behavior is in many ways as important as structure, but it is important to get the structure of a project right. And if you look at what we've represented on this slide, we're essentially saying, okay, this project is being divided up into three sub-teams. And the reason there's three sub-teams here is likely because these are three clusters of deliverables where it makes sense for people and tasks to be grouped together to achieve a set of related outcomes. And sometimes these teams are interdisciplinary, which we'll talk about what that would ultimately mean. Um, Another way to organize a project is to sort of keep all the like parties separate. So in a clinical setting, you could see having a sub-team of all the doctors, and you could have a sub-team of all the nurses, and you could have a sub-team of all the leaders and administrators for the hospital. And each of those sub-teams could collaborate on each task in the project plan. But usually a better way to do it is to put, a doctor, a nurse, and an administrator on each team, if that's relevant, and have them work on a set of tasks together. And that's what I meant by interdisciplinary. But you certainly have multiple choices with how to do it. But what you're really trying to do in the simplest of principles is you want to kind of have most of the work being done within a sub team, and you're trying to minimize the communication to the necessary communication between the sub teams. So, you're always going to have communication between sub-teams, but the sub-team construct only makes sense if most of the work can be done within a sub-team, and it's more of an exception for interactions to occur between the sub-teams. I apologize for the somewhat academic nature of that, but that is the philosophy of team design, generally speaking. Now, communications are key in a team structure. So there's structured communications and informal communications. I like practices like daily, weekly, monthly status reports, where each sub team and each person on the sub team fills out something very short that lists here's what we accomplished, here are issues we have, and here's what we're going to be doing in the next period. And that each member of the team and each member of other sub teams takes the time to familiarize themselves with what's going on a project wide basis. A lot of times that's done in a meeting where people will essentially give the highlights of their status reports, at least at a sub team level, to the entire project team. But that's a structured way of enforcing communications. The other informal is, what some people call management by walking around, but essentially, having these informal dialogues on issues. And as a program leader and a project manager, I sometimes like to go to, somebody all the way down the tree, somebody at the most basic and entry level of jobs, and talk to them about what's going on the project, as well as everybody in between. So I get a variety of different feelings for what's going on a project, and I find that informal communication to, quite honestly, be a necessity, not really an optional thing. Team size can vary, sub-team size. I tend to find that sub-teams after 6 or 8 people tend to get difficult to manage, but sometimes you're working with huge project teams where you actually have sub teams, and the 6 to 8 rule generally works well. So even on projects I've had that have hundreds of people, they're largely clustered into 6 or 8 person sub teams, and then nested to the extent that it makes sense. Two other things on this slide worth mentioning are steering committees, which make decisions, and advisory committees, which inform decisions. And very, very important in almost any program and project management. And the way these are managed and used is very, very important. Now, a lot of times people feel like you need to get everybody's input to make a decision, and that's not always true, right? Your goal is to collect enough information such that you can make a quality decision. So typically, I would see an advisory committee, being a manageably large size, representing the key constituencies, and maybe individual groups within each constituency. So if you're doing a project that affects, a location, and there's 3 or 4 community groups involved, you could see the advisory committee having one person from each community group on it. When you get to the steering committee, this is where the tough decisions are actually ultimately made, and it's counterproductive to have each stakeholder and each stakeholder subgroup represented on the steering committee, but in some way, shape, or form, you try to have at least every major stakeholder involved in the decision making. But there has to be clear delineation of who has what decision rights from a steering committee perspective. And quite honestly, I've seen projects that confuse the advisory and the steering committee constructs, and you can imagine that leads to a bit of chaos. So some people might be a little bit bruised when they find out they're an advisory capacity, not a decision-making capacity, but it's a necessity to get things done that not everybody participates in the decision-making. The second question I wanted to cover here in the wrap up is managing programs really that different from projects? I mentioned that I've personally been responsible for small projects as well as, projects with hundreds of people. And I would say that the larger the projects, not just in terms of people, but the value being targeted, are substantially more complicated. And some of the techniques that work on a small project don't work, and they don't scale up, if you will, to larger projects, but some of them do. So there are things in common. But uh, programs generate a lot of fatigue. They tend to be longer, and because they're more complicated, they tend to hit a lot of different issues. And so, when you're thinking about the project plan and you're thinking about executing the project plan, you find yourself looking at lots of softer factors as well. People burning out, working too many hours, and frankly, the quality of the work at the late at night hours may not be as good as what you get from them first thing in the morning. And so you have to manage lots more of the softer factors on a program, but they're still important on a project as well. The interface between the projects when you're dealing with a program is really crucial, because you've decided to kind of manage the complexity by having separate project teams focused on different things. You've got to make sure that those projects are working with each other in 2 key ways. The first one is they need to be sharing issues with each other. So when there's something that needs to be resolved, an open question that's sizable and important, there has to be a shared issue log between the project teams that is driven towards conclusions where all stakeholders have a say in the process, because the coordination challenges get pretty extreme. So if you've got one team that's focused on building out a new physical facility on your campus, and another group that's getting the physicians and the nurses and the clinical teams ready to occupy a floor in the building to provide a certain set of services, they obviously need to be interfacing on the key topics that matter. So the design of the space, for example, or the dates on which it's ready for occupancy and when it's going to be ready for patients, all those kind of things need to be coordinated between teams. Now, how do you grow a program manager? Well, generally speaking, it's people who have gotten good at smaller projects. And not everybody who can manage small projects well wants to or is capable of making the leap. But that's a pretty good starting point for finding people who can manage program managers. Most organizations end up, growing them over time by dedicating people to program and project-like activities. Some organizations don't actually think of program and project management as a valuable enough skill or a valuable enough career track, and that rubs off. And people, if they don't feel valued, they won't want to be in the role, and the organization has a hard time, uh, you know. Cultivating program and project management skills. So, I suggest that if you've got a lot of complex work ahead of you, you make sure that people have a choice to spend considerable chunks of their professional career focused on program and project management, and the culture sends the signals that those things are valued. So I don't mean to wrap up on a negative note, but I am going to talk a little bit about project successes and failures and some of the things that I have seen. Um, what I would hope to do when conducting this course in person is engage people in a conversation. Hopefully, people are willing to talk about something in their recent experience that was a failure and something in their recent experience that was a success that makes this far more real to the audience. But let me just give you kind of four examples, and I won't go into infinite detail on them. But the first one is lack of change control. So managing scope as much as resource and schedule. It's easy to want to try to keep everybody happy by just adding things to your plate, the project team's plate, if you will. And change control is the deliberate act of deciding what you add to scope, and frankly, sometimes what you take out of scope is equally important. But having a formalized process around that can be the linchpin between success and failure. So, an example in my past was that we had a set of transactional capabilities so that customers could interact with the company, was what the basic scope of the project was. And some of the client wanted to start building some informational capabilities where they could assess the transactional data and look at it in an analytic lens. And while it makes complete sense to do, we executed change control to say, hey, look, that's a different project. Let's do that project if it's important, and of course it was. But let's not make it part of this project. Let's finish this project successfully and use that as a foundation to do the next project. So change control is very, very important. The second one I've mentioned a couple times is too many part-time resources, right? So I know this is particularly true in the mission setting, but there's so much work to do and it's all important and it's God's work. So it's very hard to figure out what not to do. And we all like to wear multiple hats. We like that variety in our work. But the more complex a project gets, the more you need dedicated project resources on it. It's okay for somebody to be pulled off a floor in a care center and focus their time on a project for 3 or 4 months. In fact, it might be rewarding and it might be a nice break from the day-to-day grind to be able to do that. It doesn't mean people aren't going to work as hard. It just means that they're going to have the opportunity to focus, and we're going to get their highest quality effort and time dedicated to the project. The third issue is what I call reopening the polls or lingering issues. So it's really important to have an issue log and to manage it well. But sometimes we think we've resolved issues, but they're never really closed. And that's what I mean by reopening the polls. And this is a symptom of a problem in project management. But you might have a management discussion and decide that a certain issue will be handled a certain way. But every single time you get together as a management team, somebody wants to revisit it and change the outcome. That's the reopen poll, right? And that can be incredibly debilitating to a project team, which, looks at all the noise that creates and is unsure what to do next and is hard to make progress with that. And so having a very strong issue resolution process is anchored in having a really good log, a log that says, here's specifically what the issue is in wording that everybody can understand. Here's how we're going to address that issue. Here's how we're going to resolve that issue. Here's our target resolution date. Here's when we're going to try to get that issue resolved by. Here are the implications of that issue, so that everybody is clear about its importance and its impact. So issue management is a very key one. And the last one I've mentioned here as well is contrasting assumptions, especially as projects get a little bit bigger. Everybody having a different assumption on a key issue might spell doom for the project. And I think we all probably have examples of this, but let's say that we're opening a surgical ward and our target date is March 1st to have the surgical ward open for our first patient to be able to have surgery there. And let's say that some people interpret the March 1st date as the date with which we could actually physically do the surgery. And other people assume that March 1st is a date when we'll be willing to start scheduling surgeries. So some people on the project are thinking, hey, we're going to start doing surgeries March 1st. And other people think, well, March 1st, we're going to start scheduling surgeries, and maybe we'll have some emergency surgeries, but scheduled surgeries won't happen for some time after that date. A simple miscommunication, but different assumptions can have big impacts, and I think that's a good case example of how that could occur. Well, this is time to wrap up. Of course, this would all be, I think, more interesting if it was interactive and being done in person, but I do think it's very valuable to have this as a resource for anybody who's going to be either working with us to train people or maybe wants to take the task upon themselves to conduct the training. Program and project management is a critical discipline. There is so much work to get done in the mission system and the countries and the people that we're trying to help, that we need to make best use of our resources. And we also need to challenge ourselves and challenge other people to continuously improve. So I hope this was a good introduction, and God bless you.